Page 10 of the paper. And so CORD now calls a meeting over Paul's law. So yesterday we had CORD leaders summon all the elected leaders to a meeting next week to decide the controversial amendments that were passed by the Senate, and they will be announcing the next step after that. But of course, this bill also now, the buck stops with the president. You know, he's yet to sign the bill, and whether or not he will sign it is something that will also reflect on what CORD's next step will be. But the impending threat is mass action, of course. Do you think this is likely to happen?
Now, for you to win an election in Kenya, there are some, when you look at the critical path analysis, the first thing you need to be sure is your supporters are actually, who are above 18, are registered as Kenyans. They've got a voters, or rather, they've got an ID card or a passport. And then number two, they've been registered as voters. And the IBC is supposed to start registering voters from 16th of this month. And if you were seated in the CORD strategy team, what I would tell them to do is go back and ask all their voters, or rather ask their supporters, to register number one as Kenyans, and then go register as voters. Because it may just be the case that we are going to have a full automated voting process. But if your supporters are not registered as voters, if all they can do is demonstrations on social media, then that is not going to give you the presidency. And looking at CORD and where they sit today, it's unlikely that they're going to go into mass action immediately. I suspect they're going to look at their members and tell them to go and register as Kenyans and register as voters in the first instance before they can think of mass action. There's no way you can have mass action and then the registration process is taking place. Because the only thing you will do is to make Jubilee supporters very nervous, and they're going to register to the last man as voters. And eventually, when you kill the manual backup, they'll go and cast the ballots, and you'll be licking your wounds. And I think that's what they need to do. However, they've indicated that they've already gone to the courts, and they expect the courts to give a ruling in their favor. And again, on the face of it, without even the benefit of law, when you're coming up with any legislation in Kenya, number one, there must be public participation. And looking at the amendments laws, initially it was a product of a consensus. People discussed the laws and said, this is what we need. You remember when the proposed legislation was taken to the National Assembly and said it, the members were told, you're not going to change a comma, you're not going to change a full stop. So it went through. And one would have expected that if there were going to be amendments, again, they were going to be undertaken through public participation. That committee should have been requested to sit and go through the amendments. And also the amendments, they're not necessarily, so dangerous. They're very good amendments. But it's because of the suspicion and mistrust in Kenya that CORD fears Jubilee is up to some mischief. Now, when these were introduced to the National Assembly, members of the public were not given the opportunity to give their view. And I suspect that any rational Kenyan going to the High Court and saying that there was no public participation in this would have the laws reviewed. Even if the president signs it into law, the High Court is likely to kick them out. Now, that opens another Pandora's box, that everybody who went to the Senate to present their views, including members of the business community, including the chambers of commerce, religious leaders, civil society.
Media stakeholders.
Everybody, even the media stakeholders. And you recall SK Mashera made statements which were fairly alarming. Everybody was in agreement that we need a backup. But the backup must not be manual. It can be an electronic backup. Everybody was in agreement. So one wonders then, what kind of knowledge does Jubilee have to insist that we must have a manual backup? And for some reason, because the majority is not always right, maybe Mr. Kenyatta and Mr. Ruto are right on this, but why can't they educate the public for them to tell us this is the reason why we're insisting on a manual backup? Because if they give us logical thinking, then everybody says, we'll congratulate them, we say that's why you're leaders, you're giving us a vision. But it's very curious that everybody in Kenya, apart from Mr. Ruto and Mr. Kenyatta, are saying we do not need a manual backup. The argument by Mr. Musheru, the ICT Cabinet Secretary, is appalling. It may make people interested in digital space to go back to manual. The comments by Githu Muigai were appalling. But more appalling are statements made yesterday by Professor Kithure Kindiki and Kipchumba Murkomen that we decided to pass these legislations as they were, but there's going to be an opportunity for amendment in future. Which begs the question, if we are doing the wrong thing, why should we do the wrong thing
to completion,
then we wait to come back and start amending? And I think some leaders in Kenya, the political class, they imagine for some reason that Kenyans, who are largely rational, like, we are goats, that will just go with the kind of logic they give us.
Right.
And even COD has also not given us a very solid reasoning as to why they don't like the manual backup.
System.
They've not given us very solid reasoning. Because the only thing they're telling us that we are going to have dead voters. And during the petition hearing in the Supreme Court during the last election, we were told there were about 1.2 million people who are described as either ghost voters or dead voters. But even COD still needs to convince us, instead of just wiping emotions, that these guys want to rig elections.
Right.
They need to come with some sort of a chart and tell us how this is going to happen. Like I recall the debates in the US Congress and Senate, that Bernie Sanders, when he's discussing something, he comes with a chart, with a felt pen, and he takes you through the systems. But COD has not done that, and Jubilee has not done that. So now Kenyans are wondering that in August, when I go cast my ballot, number one, will my ballot count? And your ballot is supposed to count, because for one to become president is the 50+1. And then after casting my ballot, am I going to be safe? Or somebody will come and kill my goats, burn my property, or even kill me because I've taken advantage of the democratic process. So I really think the buck stops with Mr. Kenyatta. If there's a very good reason as to why he needs to have a manual backup, they need to tell us. And even this manual backup must be anchored in some sort of framework that everybody is happy with the manual backup. But it's not always the case. It's not the case that the only backup you can have is manual. And you gave a very good example of a plane. When you are in a plane and it's a 17-hour flight, all the way from, say, South Africa to New Zealand, you do not start asking the pilot, what's your manual backup, or what's your plan B? If something happens and you are on air, you just drop to the sea and die. But of course, the ICT professionals in Kenya have said it's possible to have a plan B and a plan C and D all the way to Z. Because again, when you isolate the issues, the only things which are supposed to be electronic, number one, is the registration, number two, identification, number three, tallying. You don't even need a professor of engineering or ICT. You don't need Bill Gates to come and assist us do this thing. Some of these senators were coming up with very ridiculous arguments. One from Kericho said that a majority of my voters are tea pickers. So every time they're picking their tea, they lose sight of their fingerprints. But you can use your eyes. And it's the same argument which was being advanced by the Murang'a senator, saying that a majority of his voters work in the quarry, but they've got eyes. I mean, really, some of these arguments you really begin to wonder. Yeah. So there's so many opportunities.
All right. And I'd like us, just before we continue, we're still on the same issue, of course.